Hello and welcome to the Open Nurses interview broadcast. I'm Andrew Penn. I'm one of the co-founders of Open Nurses and excited to have you all here with us today, either watching streaming or archived online. I'm very excited to have with us today Dr. Alex Belser, who's a friend and colleague of many of us here at Open Nurses. Dr. Alex Belser is a psychedelic researcher and a licensed psychologist. For the last 20 years, he's been a leader in the psychedelic clinical community, having served as an investigator on a number of clinical trials of psilocybin and MDMA to treat depression, anxiety, substance use, OCD, PTSD, and end-of-life distress. He is the founding president of Nautilus Sanctuary, the first nonprofit center for psychedelic medicine on the East Coast. He serves as the chief clinical officer for Cybin. Dr. Belser's research has been featured on the front page of the New York Times, in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Guardian, and in Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. Dr. Belser has authored over a dozen peer-reviewed journal articles and chapters and has given over 50 lectures, presentations, and grand rounds about psychedelic medicine. At Yale, Dr. Belser is investigating psychedelic treatments for OCD. He's worked as a therapist on studies of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and the treatment of severe PTSD. He previously served on the board of advisors to Compass Pathways, which was then at that time a nonprofit organization. He's a member of Chacruna Institute's Women, Gender Diversity, and Sexual Minorities Working Group, where he works on issues affecting LGBTQI plus people. So it is really my pleasure to bring Dr. Alex Belser onto the Open Nurses interview.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. It's good to be here.
Yeah, sorry about the technical issues at the beginning there. Welcome. You know, I was thinking when I met you was it's 6 or 7 years ago now, in Amsterdam. You and I were at that conference at the Open Foundation, which is shares our name, put on in Amsterdam in 2016, and I think I got to meet. I was introduced by common mentor Jeff Gus to you and some of your colleagues then at NYU.
I remember that conference very fondly. It's always fun to talk about psychedelic medicine in Amsterdam, so it was good to get connected with you there. Yeah,
it seems like a perfect setting.
Yeah,
yeah. Well, you know, it was at that conference that I found myself sitting next to Amanda Fielding. And for those who are unfamiliar with Amanda Fielding, she is a long-standing member of the psychedelic community and has been funding a lot of the work going on through the Beckley Foundation at Imperial College. And I was having a little moment of anxiety, thinking, should I introduce myself to her or not? I mean, she is, a British aristocrat. And after the speaker ended, I turned to her and I said, "Excuse me, are you Amanda Fielding?" And she said something which I've always remembered. She says, "I am." And who are you? And I introduced myself, and she says, "Well, what's your part in all of this?" So that seems like a really great place to start, Alex. What is your part in all of this? How did you get started? How did you get started in psychedelics? And tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Well, I mean, maybe my story is not so different from many of the people listening or watching. I was just completely bowled over, fascinated with what psychedelics are. When I was a kid in college, reading Stan Grof's work, at the time, the man who would become my boyfriend, one of my first boyfriends in school, gave me his 1976 text on LSD psychotherapy, and I was reading what Grof was saying, and I realized Stan Grof was still alive and speaking, and I went to a psychedelic conference in Berkeley in 2001, and I was just floored by the presence of the people there. You know, we had the Arrowids were there from the Fire and Earth Arrowid. Sasha Shulgin and his wife Ann Shulgin were lecturing and signing autographed copies of PCAL and TCAL, and Stan Grof was speaking, and it was an interesting time before really there was any above ground clinical approved sanctioned research happening in the academy. The last 20 years or so have seen huge changes. And my part in this is that I'm a psychologist. I'm passionate about psychotherapy. and um, I mean, I get to work with patients in a variety of different contexts, and I think, Andrew, we've talked a little bit about this, but it's been so rewarding to be able to work with patients doing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy work. The sense of meaning and potential catalyst for transformation that occurs is unlike anything I've ever seen. And I'm a big proponent of good old fashioned talk therapy, or even new modes of talk therapy. I really think they can help a lot of people, and they do. But I consistently meet with people who tell me they are stuck, and psychedelics help. Oftentimes people get unstuck. Where they go from there is up to them. And I think in some large measure, dependent upon what kind of culture we help co-create with them in the clinic room, in the clinical studies, in our broader culture. And so that's where my interest has laid. And I did a lot of more conventional research in my doctorate. I did LGBTQ research. I did like some prison abolition work and criminological research. And I think that's really important work. But frankly, I continue to be fascinated by psychedelic medicine. They're so interdisciplinary. They raise always more questions at the end of a good conversation about them than they answer whenever we try to talk about what it is that's happening. And I think it's likely I'll be spending the rest of my life and career doing some sort of psychedelic clinical research work. So I hope that that's my part in this. Or part of it anyway. So it's good to have a psychedelic chat with you today.
Well, you are characteristically modest about your role and your piece of all this, because I know for those of you who may not be familiar, you were part of the NYU study on people with anxiety who had cancer who were being treated with psilocybin. Could you tell us a little bit about that study, which has really become one of those landmarks in the research?
Yeah, this is in 2006. Jeff, Gus, and I went to Basel, Switzerland, to celebrate Albert Hoffman's 100th birthday party. So Hoffman is the chemist who first synthesized LSD and psilocybin, and he was still alive and turned 100 years old. And it was the first really serious psychedelic conference I'd ever been to, where there were a whole litany of incredible talks and people talking about clinical and research issues. And I started to realize, and I think Jeff, Gus did too, that we could potentially bring this into our professional lives in some meaningful way. So with Steve Ross and Tony Bossis, we started a psychedelic reading group, which became the psychedelic research group and team at NYU. And we, at the time, and in the 1950s and 60s, the most common use of psychedelic therapies was with people with end-of-life distress or with cancer, and followed closely by substance use issues, particularly alcoholism. And so, besides Rick Strassman's work with DMT, which is normally with healthy, normal people, and then the first 2006 study from Hopkins, which again was with healthy people, people hadn't really worked in a patient population. And Alicia Danforth and Charlie Grobe and others had led the way at UCLA with this incredible study treating people with cancer and cancer anxiety with psilocybin and good psychotherapy. And so that study was something that we picked up the protocol at NYU. And then our colleagues at Hopkins also picked up a protocol, and we co-published the findings. And my role was really to interview in depth the patients in the study about what on earth it was like to take psychedelic medicine. It's one thing to say, oh, you score a 60 on the mystical experience questionnaire, or here on the hallucinogen rating scale, or here's your blood pressure readings for the last 6 hours. It's another thing to really sit down and talk with the people who are taking the medicine and say, so what happened for you, and how do you make sense of what happened for you, especially in the story, the narrative of your own struggle. So these are folks who had, oftentimes late stage cancer or recurring, cancers that could recur, and had anxiety and existential distress about them, and also depression. And we administered moderate, maybe moderate to high dose of psilocybin, 0.3 milligrams per kilogram of human body weight, with a lot of prep psychotherapy and integration psychotherapy, a single dose. And we saw really strong responses in terms of people feeling less anxiety, feeling much less depressed. We had 80% response for people with depression and their depressive symptoms. And we also saw that lasting for many years, up to 4 years later in long-term sort of follow-ups. These are not blinded, and these are people that knew that got medicine 4 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And it was incredible. It's just like these conditions where people have anxiety about something that's really specific, like what it's like to not only deal with cancer, but then deal with the treatments for cancer, chemotherapy,
Mm-hmm.
radiation, surgery, anxiety about recurrence. We don't manage that very well in America. We don't think about our own deaths. We don't have conversations in medicine about it. And we certainly don't support people as well as we could when they're going through these incredibly challenging times. And we published an interview study about that. And Andrew, you picked up the torch and ran with that and used some of those quotations in an incredible model and paper that you put together with others around Caritas and nursing practice. And I think that's really important to think coherently about what is it that the patients are telling us? What is it that happens? How do we best support them in psychedelic medicine sessions? And how do we think coherently about our theory, our practice, our presence in the room? It can't just be a slapdash effort. We have to really dig in and think seriously about what's required to support this, because it's not like other medicine and it's not like other psychotherapy.
Absolutely, yeah, and your qualitative approach to it was one of the reasons why I think as nurses we feel real kindred spirit with the work that you're doing, because we had Maria Mangini on here about a year ago who was talking about the inherently qualitative nature of nursing. That we tend to be a tribe of storytellers, even when we give report in the hospital. It's a story peppered with data points, but it's inherently qualitative. And so, when I saw your paper many years ago, it really felt like I was in the room with you, with these patients. And of course, this study has been documented in various films and such. And so some of those stories have been told even more widely. But I mean, when, it's thinking back now, we, at that time, really, as you say, there's only been a handful of people that had done this, Charlie Grove and Alicia Danforth, and of course the pre-prohibition work. But I can only imagine you must have felt like you were, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it must have seemed like you were witnessing history in that moment.
It felt kind of nuts, I gotta say. I was sort of closeted about it. In fact, I mean, it wasn't something I advertised to my dissertation committee or my faculty at NYU or at Columbia, where I was like, I'm doing psychedelic research. I kept it under wraps because a lot of people were not so friendly to that, even today, certainly, although something happened about 5 years ago and the weather vane just turned 180 degrees, where we just had an explosion of research and funding and what used to be a taboo in the discipline, where people thought you're kind of a little nutty if you're doing psychedelic medicine. I think frankly, it's only because in part of some of the privilege, intersecting levels of privilege that I have, where I'm a white cisgender man with the academic credentials that I have and the way that I look and present, that allows me in part to get in front of a room and talk about giving people high doses of psilocybin. I think it changed. It was something that I in some ways I felt like was almost like a subversive project, which is to take this thing which has been outlawed as a Schedule I drug. There's been a massive drug war of which it's been a part, with massive harms, largely to disenfranchised populations, disenfranchised people in the world and in the United States, and then to, from the inside, talk about how it could revolutionize the way that we care for each other. And starting with dying people, starting with people with cancer, there was a reason for that. It was incredibly motivating, but it was really a different time. There were a lot of structural and institutional impediments to it. It took a long time to get the study off the ground, but now, we see the opposite happening, which is most institutions, universities are scrambling to establish centers for psychedelic research. Young PIs and people in the field are trying to make a career in it, whereas before it was like a sideline research. You had to bring in your funding through a conventional NIH and IMH NSF grant, and then if you had extra time, you and some of your colleagues could try to, through philanthropy, fund a psychedelic clinical trial, and you would do that over many, many years. It wouldn't be your mainstay. So that's really different now. And I talk to students all the time, and people entering, nurses, psychologists, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, who want to know how to get involved. And the discourse has really shifted. The Overton window has opened much wider than it was 15 years ago, where you really had to, what seemed possible was quite limited. And there's more research happening in the last 6 months than there were in the first, 16 years of the Renaissance, as it's called, the resurgence in psychedelic medicine.
Gosh, it's so true. There was a time when I think I could honestly say I'd read all the articles that had been published in not anymore. I can hardly keep up. I'm interested, you said something, and I also want to encourage people that are watching this live to go ahead and put questions in the comments, and we'll get to those towards the end of the conversation. You talked about coming out, and I'm interested to hear more about that, because nursing tends to run pretty conservative as a profession, particularly in our leadership. I think sort of sometimes the ground level is a little more radicalized than our leadership, and in the ivory towers. And so nursing is probably where psychology was a decade ago with regards to embracing psychedelics. And I'm curious to hear your experience of making it known that this was something you were interested in studying, and starting to really leverage your career on this, and your credibility. I mean, you took some big risks, especially early in your career, when people often tend to kind of play it safe, particularly within academia. So would love to hear more about that.
I mean, my bet is that for most people listening, I don't know where people are working in different settings. There's still onus and potentially risk associated with sticking your neck out and saying, yeah, psychedelic medicine is potentially something that I want to do. Certainly there's risk in coming out of the closet as somebody who might have used psychedelics in your own private practice, or in what are called in the research literature naturalistic settings, in the underground. There's certainly penalties. The biggest among them is that it's illegal, and I think that there's a disproportionate penalty paid by certain people in our communities. But Nishay Devaneux wrote this interesting piece many years ago, and she and I have discussed the sort of metaphor of coming out of the closet as a gay man, as a queer person, as I have, and have to do continuously, because people keep assuming I'm straight unless I designate otherwise. Versus coming out of the psychedelic closet as somebody who's interested in psychedelics, wants to talk with colleagues, potentially patients about them, even doing psychedelic support in the community for the millions of people who are using them all the time, and show up in our offices and our clinics and hospitals. Or somebody who might use them themselves in a facilitated setting, in an ayahuasca circle, and a psilocybin or MDMA circle. And I'm, as a gay person, I'm like totally in favor of people using this, although I know that there's some concern about psychedelic community co-opting this. But I think that the psychedelic communities, and I've spoken about this in Queering Psychedelics, which is this incredible conference that Chacruna and Clancy Kavanagh and B.N. Labache and others have helped to put on, that the psychedelic community has a lot to learn from the queer communities. There's actually a lot of ways in which there's crossover here. They're both stigmatized communities. They both come sort of in these sort of like sideways hierarchy, horizontal identities rather than vertical identities. It's not coming from a single lineage like a church tradition and family structure. It's just coming, you get psychedelic users from all walks of life, just in the same way that you get queer people from all families and social and community and religious structures. And so there's a real pluralism in the community. And there are, in different pockets of the world, like different forms of discrimination for each of those communities in different ways. They're not the same, and I don't want to paint over that. But my encouragement to a lot of people when they speak with me about, how do I get involved, is it's not really so much that they don't know how to get involved, it's that they're worried that if they start doing this, that there's not a clear path towards career advancement for young people. It's not really sure what kind of blowback they're going to get. It's not really sure what sort of opportunity costs they may have in terms of getting tenure or getting a job, putting this on your resume that this is what you did for 5 years of your life. And it's easy for me to say this, but like I kind of want to encourage people to to really put themselves out there and to pursue what they love and what they're most interested in, and trust that there will be setbacks. But my hope is that on the whole, that I don't know anyone who's gotten involved in psychedelics who really regrets it and wishes they had done a more conservative, more square, more conventional line of research. I've never heard anyone say, "I wish I had never gotten involved with this." So my encouragement is like, come out and step up, pitch in, see what you want to do.
Yeah.
Find out what your part is in all of this.
Right. Yeah. Well, Amanda's words. Yeah. And to really step into that. I mean, one of the things that I enjoy about this most is the community. The people that I meet in the psychedelic space are some of the most interesting Renaissance personable people you could ever hope to meet. So that's half of what keeps me involved in it. Well, there's so many things I want to ask you about. You recently published a paper that in Frontiers of Psychology, just last week, I believe, or the week before last, talking about psychotherapy in psychedelic spaces. And we were talking a little bit before you came on, before we went live, about how, I'm sure you probably had this too, Alex, when you would present on your work. I would get asked a lot of the times, what kind of therapy are you doing in these sessions? Is it CBT? Is it psychoanalytic work? What are you doing? And usually my answer was something along the lines of, inner healing intelligence, maybe some IFS work in there, but it was, interdirected, non-directive, but there wasn't a lot of clear sort of description of that therapy until fairly recently. I'm thinking of some of the work you've done and some of the work that Roz Watts and the folks in the Imperial Group have begun doing to try and bring elements of ACT into this work. But you've created this model called Embark. It's a fantastic acronym, very appropriate for psychedelic trip journeying, and would love to hear more about what that is, what's involved with that, and where you're using that in your work.
Yeah, like I said before, and maybe before the show started, I'm really passionate about psychotherapy. I really believe it's a path for healing and transformation and insight. And I'll say that I feel so grateful that I got to study with and get trained by some of the leading psychedelic therapists in the field, including Bill Richards and Jeff Guss and Annie and Michael Mithofer and Raquel Bennett on MDMA and psilocybin and ketamine therapies. And so for this article, and when Bill Brennan, who's really the lead author here, and I really want to tip my hat to his contributions and acknowledge them. When we looked at the different models, we looked at 17 existing models of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And we feel like this should be centered because oftentimes in these protocols and in even the published articles about them, they'll say we did psilocybin. They'll say nothing about what this incredibly intensive psychotherapy component is. I mean,
Mhm.
usually when you publish on psychotherapy, you describe the psychotherapy, but oftentimes they'll just say we did psilocybin with some sort of supportive psychotherapy. They won't even describe the interventions or what the frame is or what the theoretical construct is, what the proposed mechanisms for change are, like how it interacts with the psychedelic medicine, what the preparation looks like, what the integration looks like really basic questions. And so I kind of joke that like the models of psychedelic psychotherapy were often a little underbaked. And that being said, there were also some incredibly beautiful healing work and often very successful treatments. So I don't, what we looked at was we published this article and we published a table of the 17 different existing models, and we offer a little bit of a loving critique of them. But we wanted to distill and learn from what has come before, and to, if things are a little underbaked, how do we cohere them in a way that makes sense to people who really care about doing psychotherapy and working with medicine? And we came up with Embark. We talked to senior teachers in the field. I've building on many years of interviewing patients firsthand and studies at NYU and Yale, and talking with MDMA patients who've taken MDMA and thinking about what it is, like thinking critically about and reflexively about what it is that we're doing. So is it okay if I walk through what Embark is for a second?
Oh, I would love that. Yeah, please.
So Embark's an acronym. It stands EMBARNK. There's the 6 domains, and each domain is a way to bring into the clinical space what we know happens consistently with psychedelic medicine. The E domain is the existential and spiritual domain. We know that when people get psilocybin, that they have mystical experiences, religious, profound experiences that they describe in spiritual terms. The psychotherapy has to reflect that. There has to be like a spiritual counseling aspect to this. You can't have somebody that isn't able to speak with people about their experience of the God, of their understanding, or the profound experience of religious, spiritual consciousness that they may have just had, without a framework to invite that and to tell people they may experience that, and that to help people make sense of it. The M domain in Embark is the mindfulness domain. And this is a way to encourage people to be present non-judgmentally in the current moment, both before and after, and sometimes even during the psychedelic medicine session, to use sort of metacognitive interventions to help people resource, but also like come into the present moment in a way that supports their experience. There's a whole lineage of mindfulness literature along coming out of Hopkins and other organizations. When I was interviewing patients in the NYU cancer study and beyond, we also noticed that something was really missing, which is that people kept on talking about taking psilocybin and having really important body experiences, important embodied somatic experiences, visions of their corpuscles and their veins going into their body, black masses of fear or rage being ejected from their body in mushroom clouds, people taking their fear of cancer and moving their arms wildly in the room and feeling like it was draining out the tips of their fingers. So these really powerful experiences. And so in the Embark model, the B domain acknowledges that, okay, the body does keep the score. The body can be a site for healing, potentially. And so somatic components need to be included. The A domain is the affective and cognitive domain. This is about encouraging people to not avoid feeling states, especially the hard ones, especially the ones that are fearful or scary or enraging. Or guilt-inducing, but to move toward those spaces in the medicine work and to be able to talk about them afterward, because resistance to those strong feelings is oftentimes what's driving behaviors that may not be aligned with their long-term goals.
Right.
The R domain is the other thing that was missing in a lot of this work, which is like is the relationships. It's the relationship of the person who's taking the medicine to the facilitators in the room, the two people oftentimes in the room. Also, when I was talking with patients, I didn't even ask about their family directly, but they all talked about their families. They took psilocybin and they had visions of their wife, their husband or mom or dad or grown kids, that boyfriend in college that they never forgave. And those relationships were important. They had visions of their deceased ancestors. They were led by their father who died many years ago, like Virgil led Dante through their vision as like a sort of psychopomp. And so the art domain in Embark acknowledges all of these relational aspects, and it's as opposed to like a straight up CBT intervention where you don't really necessarily even acknowledge that in a meaningful way. Oftentimes, I don't want to denigrate CBT, but that's not a central way of working in that sort of psychotherapeutic modality. And then the last piece was, I think, really important, which is like, it's not just about altered states, it's about altered traits. And so the K domain is keeping momentum. So in Embark, keeping momentum is a relapse prevention piece, which just says, okay, like, yeah, it's all about integration. You can have incredible visionary experiences and big experiences, but what are your long-term goals? What is it that you want? How do you translate what has happened to you into meaningful, lasting change, if that's what you want in your life? How do you become less depressed and stay that way? How do you plan for setbacks and let those setbacks not become complete relapses into drinking again or into full-fledged depression? How do you take advantage of the critical window of neuroplasticity that opens up to allow for new learning, to give up old habits that are ingrained, like depressive rumination, and to take up new habits to keep momentum, like mindfulness or self-compassion practice. So together, those are the 6 domains of Embark. And I'll just close by saying the most important thing here is, given everything that we've learned in the ethical space in the last 5 years and before, Embark has 4 care cornerstones that are about ethical practice. And we've invited leading faculty in the space to teach on ethically rigorous care, culturally competent care, collective care, and trauma-informed care to help really ground the work. Most psychotherapies, you do the psychotherapy and then you say, oh, well, by the way, it has to be ethical. It's sort of like a practice that the APA might publish. But what if we actually brought ethics broadly conceived into the actual development, coherent theoretical development of the therapy, and then train people from the get-go in that? So it's not just an afterthought or a footnote, but really a central piece. And so anyway, you can tell I'm really excited for this model. We're piloting it at the University of Washington on a psilocybin study under the leadership of Dr. Tony Back, who is treating frontline healthcare clinicians, doctors and nurses and healthcare workers who've been on the front lines of the COVID pandemic with psilocybin and with Embark. And we'll also be piloting it in our at Cybin in our sponsored trial at Clinilabs in New Jersey to treat people with major depressive disorder. And so I'm excited to see how it goes.
Yeah, we're hoping to get Tony on here one of these days to talk about that study, because it's so important, especially following the pandemic. The wonderful thing about Embark, as I was reading it, and having done psychedelic therapy and studies, everything was familiar. But the beautiful thing was you were describing things which were very familiar, but I had never really put to words. And to be able to outline something that is often kind of ineffable, but to be able to articulate it is so important, to be able to, especially as we're going to be scaling this up and communicating this to more therapists. How do we do this? And you mentioned something in there about bodily awareness, and I'd love to hear you say more about this, because as I think anyone who's familiar with the psychedelic space right now is aware, we've been encountering some really disturbing stories about transgressions of appropriate boundaries and things crossing over into the sexual and whatnot, which obviously is never appropriate. And sometimes some of the proposed solutions to that would be to never have any touch, for example, which, if you've done this kind of work, may not actually be not only not practical, but maybe not even appropriate either. but yet there's clearly there's got to be guardrails around touch so that it's done appropriately. But clearly you mentioned that in your paper and bring in this bodily awareness. So I'd love to hear you talk more about your thoughts on how we navigate that safely, appropriately, and ethically.
Yeah, I mean, how many days do you have to talk about this? Because it's central and important, and we've just finished a training for our facilitators where we had a module on touch, and I there's so much that could be said, but I think what I want to stress is that I think that we have a lot to learn, and I think guardrails are important, but it's also about um, together co-authoring a clinical praxis and community and culture where we look at what we're doing and why we're doing it, that we discuss meaningfully why you felt a need to offer your hand at this moment or not. Why, when the patient says, "Can I have a hug?" you agree or don't agree. And what are boundaries? Like what happens when somebody texts you at midnight and they're in distress, and then you want to call them and have a conversation late in the night that potentially doesn't hold a firm boundary, but might feel clinically important to pursue in that moment. And does that lead to other transgressions? And, it's important to put guardrails on, but no amount of rulemaking is going to solve the problem, because this is something that comes up generation after generation in medicine, in psychotherapy, certainly in psychedelic work. I think that I am in favor in this work of an important double consenting process where you discuss and co-author a consent process for forms of supportive touch. By supportive touch, I mean hand holding, a hand on a shoulder, potentially a hug, a standing hug. When the person is sober in the preparatory sessions, along with the conversation that you have about what they might expect with the medicine, how it's going to go, what the schedule is, So you have a lot of psychoeducation to what they might expect. And that includes a conversation with agreements around touch. And then the double consent is that you check in again in the moment. Because I've had patients who reach out their hand and what they ask for my hand because they're scared. And I will say, it can be one of the most meaningful experiences to be able to offer a hand to somebody and to say, let's just it's dangerous and potentially bad in some circumstances. Let's just outlaw touch entirely feels like a gross overstep and potentially counter-therapeutic. I do think that when you look at, and Bill Brennan gives an excellent talk on this, the lineage of practices in psychedelic medicine, there's this whole lineage around that's not necessarily trauma-informed, like the work of Salvador Riquet. There's a lineage of challenging touch, where clinicians would, encourage people to push against them to sort of amplify feelings of resistance so that they could have a breakthrough moment. And I think that there are potentially good reasons to have that, but those sorts of challenging touch are I think more problematic and probably require a lot more ethical and training thought than a lot of people are getting. And I am in favor of well considered consensual supportive touch, like hand holding and hand on shoulder forms of touch in a collective experience of integrity, and I think that that's possible, and I have to believe that we are capable of doing that in good ways. I know that we can be, and I just don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's interesting having a little bit of cross-pollination between professions happening here, because I think nursing and psychotherapy have very different relationships with touch. In nursing, touch is just part of what we do. It's really a head, heart, and hands profession,
Yeah.
and so touch I've had trainees who have actually who've come from other areas of nursing, and they're transitioning into advanced practice psychiatric nursing, saying, actually, you probably don't want to touch your patients as much as you're doing, because they were constantly reaching over and, reassuring, putting a hand on an arm. But, they said, well, I do this all the time in clinic, and it having to kind of almost unlearn that in the psychiatric space. But, this idea that caring for another person's body is really a sacred act, that Gene Watson talked about when we wrote that paper together. I think I couldn't agree with you more that we have to find a way to do this ethically and professionally. And, and I loved, there was another acronym that I wanted to point out, which in your paper, which was just a really beautiful capturing of the quality of presence that people bring to psychedelic work. And it was cushion. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. The idea with cushion is that we want people to, it's about therapeutic presence. So what does therapeutic presence mean? And I'm sure we all know this, like when you're in the room with a patient and then someone else walks in the hospital, you can tell their presence immediately, right? It's like, are they calm or activated? Are they hurried and harried or in rushed? Or are they attentive to you and the interpersonal? Are they attuned to what's happening in the room? Or are they kind of blowing in like a storm? And so cushion is an acronym that Bill Brennan came up with that encourages us to be calm and hurried, supportive, human, impeccably boundaried, open, and non-judgmental. And it's not that the therapist has to be like that all the time, but there's something about that stance, that posture, not just physically, energetically, but psychic posture, that invites a different openness and response for people. And it's sort of a frame, a platform for a different type of work. And it implies a receptivity to the patient, the person's experience, so that they feel like there's space for them to take up more space, to actually share what's happening for them, to disclose what's happening for them, to feel a deeper trust, a deeper rapport, a safer and broader sentence setting. And I think Bill Brennan came up with that beautiful acronym. And whether or not Embark, it's part of the Embark model, and I hope that people take it and use it if it's helpful for them.
Yeah, it's really nicely captured. I'd love to shift gears a little bit and hear a little more about what you're doing with Cybin, which may be a company that our listeners are familiar with or may not. So could you tell us a little bit about what Cybin is about and what you all are doing up there?
Yeah, sure. I'm the chief clinical officer at Cybin, and my job, Cybin is an organization that is trying to build programs to develop psychedelic medicines for FDA review. So we have a couple major programs, CYB3 and CYB4, that are analogs of psilocybin and DMT for the treatment of major depression and then for anxiety disorders. And so my role is to sort of figure out what is required by the FDA and the MHRA in the United Kingdom, or the EMA in Europe, or Health Canada in Canada, and design a series of clinical trials that try to answer the questions and demonstrate safety and clinical efficacy. And to do so in a way where we're not just, putting people in a dentist chair in a room and closing the door. We're really providing a supportive psychotherapy like Embark. And so Cybin has about 55 full-time employees, and we have many hundreds of consultants and advisors. We just put out a press release we have, I think, 28 different advisors just on the psychotherapy aspect alone. People are teaching all the different domains of Embark and the care cornerstones. So really experts in the field, because I don't think that any one person has all the answers here. I think it really does take an entire faculty of people to help train people and to teach people. And I've been really humbled because we have this incredible science and chemistry team and the CMC team and the people creating GMP medicine that meets all of the criteria, it's really a lot. We just had to submit an IND to the FDA, and it was over 5,000 pages. I mean, literally, we were able to submit PDFs, but they used to put these on like tablets of, you have so much paper that people can't carry it. So it's a lot of information that's required, and it takes a lot of people with different skill sets. And so most of my focus has been on developing this psilocybin analog CYB3. We're starting a new study which just approved by the IRB to treat depression, and we think that it provides some potentially significant differences and advantages potentially over psilocybin, and I can share more about that if you want to talk about it.
Yeah. I was reading on your website that it's a deuterated psilocybin and a deuterated DMT, and for those people who are not total psychopharmacology nerds like me, do you want to explain what deuterization is when you change a molecule that way?
Yeah, absolutely. What's it like being a psychopharmacology nerd?
Oh, I'm receptive.
Well, so one of the things about psilocybin is that, and don't get me wrong, I've worked on a number of psilocybin assisted psychotherapy studies. I believe in this medicine very strongly. But as a clinician who's been in the room, it's a long day. It's 8 hours. It's a long day. And we know from other medicines, psychedelic medicines that are shorter, like ketamine and 5-MeO-DMT and DMT, that potentially there are benefits to psychedelic medicines that don't have to last 8 hours or 6 hours. An hour or 2 or 3 or 4 might still be really powerful and important, meaningful clinically. And psilocybin also, and I'm getting to duration, so just hold on, but psilocybin also is not the molecule that is actually active. It's psilocin. Right. So when Hoffman first synthesized psilocybin from mushrooms, it's not shelf stable in its current form. So we had to create psilocybin, which is why when people eat it, it's demethylated in the gut, and then the actual active drug, which is psilocin, is the drug that crosses the blood-brain barrier. But because of that, it's almost like a long-form extended release tablet in the gut. It causes a lot of periphery issues. Some people have nausea. Some people feel not so great. It also has a lot of variability between patients. I mean, you may notice this with psilocybin that some people have huge experiences on the similar dose. Other people have barely threshold experiences. So we have all these complex boostering things, and some, and some of that is just due to metabolic variability between people because their body is just digesting it differently. So we with CYB3, we've tried to address some of these challenges. Deuteration is one of the things that we've been trying to manage. So deuteration just is like in all of these molecules, psilocybin, as you know, is very similar to serotonin and tryptophan. There's hydrogen all along the edges of this, and hydrogen is just one proton and one electron. Deuterium is just heavy hydrogen. It's just you add a neutron, so it's one proton, one neutron, and one electron. And what's interesting about deuterating a small molecule compound like psilocybin, or an analog of it, is that the PK becomes more stable. It's a little harder for the body to break it down, but the pharmacodynamics, the subjective effects, don't change. So the phenomenological effects, the subjective effects of the medicine are likely to be very similar, but the PK curve, how fast it comes on, how long it lasts, how it's metabolized in the body, these things change, and sometimes in ways that could be potentially helpful. And so we're finding with CYB3 that we think it's probably in this model going to come on a lot faster. So the first hour and a half with psilocybin, oftentimes people don't have really strong effects, but it'll probably come on much faster within half an hour. And instead of lasting like an 8-hour day in the clinic, it might be more like a 4-hour day. And we also think that it's going to have a much tighter metabolic variation between people, so that you're not going to see these huge swaths where some people have really big experiences and some have small. We'll get a little bit more precise.
Mm-hmm.
There's still all the issues that you have with psychedelic medicine, which is that people's psyches are different, right? People will
Mm-hmm.
experience the medicine differently, but at least in their body, how it's metabolized, and the actual medicine that gets into the central nervous system, we think we can kind of have less unpredictability there.
Yeah.
And that could be really meaningful for a variety of ways, including potentially decreasing like peripheral effects, like nausea, for example. You may not see some of that.
Okay. Oh, you're talking to a lot of nurses here. So, nurses we like control, we like precision, we like to know exactly what something is going to do when we put it in a patient's body. So, the idea of having a little more consistency. I mean, we don't give willow bark for pain. We give aspirin, right?
Yeah.
It's also I run into a lot of people that forget or maybe never learned that the psilocybin that's given in these clinical trials is not ground up mushrooms in a capsule, that it is, you mentioned the term GMP, good manufacturing practice, that it is synthetic psilocybin in all of these studies, that nobody is using actual dried fungi in these studies, because the FDA doesn't allow it.
That's right. And look, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I mean, I'm in favor of decriminalization and people being able to legally grow mushrooms. But in all of the existing clinical trials, everyone's using synthetic psilocybin. I mean, I think there's been some movement towards, trying to extract from whole product the whole mushroom psilocybin, but there hasn't been a lot of success with that so far in a way that's going to pass muster with the regulatory bodies.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about what you're doing there, because as you know, there's a lot of controversy in the psychedelic space around the pharma development of these compounds, and a lot of very kind of, there's sometimes more heat than light that gets generated in these conversations, that well, clearly there have been organizations that have really tried to kind of colonize the space and capture as much market share as possible, that there are innovations that can come through pharma that provide opportunities that may not be available with the naturally existing compounds.
I mean, to that point, like I realize that, I mean, this has been really hard. Like I did, I created a 501c3 nonprofit to do MDMA clinical research, and we get to work with patients with trauma, which is great. And I've been in the academy, but there are certain things in the current world that require tens of millions of dollars, and there's just not that much philanthropy in the system. And we've seen that with MAPS having to take major infusion of cash from Vine. There's just, Sasha Shulgin synthesized over 250 psychedelic compounds, but we're doing development through philanthropy with 2 at a time, and it's going to last over a decade. Psilocybin through USANA and MDMA through MAPS Public Benefit Corp. And I will say, I have when I talk to people, there are some favorite psychedelics that I think are potentially really beneficial that people have a relationship with, and they're MDMA, and LSD, and ketamine. And when you talk, I mean, these are obviously there's some studies that show these are really helpful for people, and people have like a really important, meaningful relationship with MDMA and LSD and ketamine. But they're also all the product of big pharma development. Bayer created MDMA, and Sandoz Pharmaceuticals created LSD, and Park Davis Pharmaceuticals created ketamine. And they're all in the public sphere now. And I think we benefit from the work that the chemists and other researchers did in those organizations. So I don't want to flatten some of the bad actors in the space at all. That's not my intent. But I do think that it's incredibly expensive and resource intensive to try to hurdle this regulatory hurdle and to fund these studies. It costs tens of millions of dollars. And that's kind of where we're at in 2022 right now. That's the major challenge. I think we'll see where it goes, and likely in this space, there's over 70 psychedelic companies. It's likely that most of them are going to fail in the next few years. All of their stocks have plummeted, and probably only the ones with a really robust group and set of people and a plan and a strategy and enough funding are going to make it through the next few years. So we'll really see what happens in the space. And I'm curious with you to see what happens.
And if anything, it seems like there's kind of a plurality of psychedelics that are going to be around. That there may be pharmacologic compounds that are used in clinical treatment settings. That will be covered by insurance. So people, hopefully, will be covered by things like Medicare. So people will have greater access to them. And places like Oregon are likely going to have things like psilocybin available for more general use. And it's not an either or, it's a both and.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to visit a future psychedelic healing center in Oregon, and I'm really curious to see how that goes for the legalization efforts there. Yeah, for sure.
There's a question in the chat about the OCD work that you're doing. Could you share a little bit about that, what that's about?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Miranda. So Francisco Moreno did this incredible work treating people with obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. I think it's over almost 20 years ago now.
Yeah, it was like 2006 or something.
Yeah, it's almost 16 years ago. And so what we saw in that study was that people had significant reductions in their Y-box score, which is sort of a gold standard measure for symptom severity with OCD. So I'm a co-investigator on a team at Yale right now under the leadership of Dr. Ben Kelmendi with others to investigate OCD, rather psilocybin treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder. And the team's published a couple of poster on this and some other work. And the individual trajectories are very promising in the preliminary research. I mean, some people really improve. People who have had lifelong OCD that can be quite debilitating, certainly intrusive, very intense and unpleasant. And they've tried other treatments, and it's, as a clinician, notoriously difficult to successfully treat OCD. But with psilocybin and a supportive context, people seem to do quite a bit better, and so much so actually that Yale's creating a program in this. I think that Ben received government funding for the first time in decades for a line of psychedelic research, Dr. Ben Kelmendi, in psilocybin as a treatment for OCD, simultaneously with Matt Johnson at Hopkins for his work on psilocybin as treatment for smoking cessation. So it's really an incredible study to be a part of, and I've gotten to interview these patients and hear firsthand what it's like to think that you're just going to suffer with OCD your whole life and maybe live a curtailed, smaller life, and then to have people describe how they still have some of the experiences, but they're not so. One person described it as like the volume just got turned way down. And he can have a more rewarding relationship with his girlfriend, and he can teach guitar and go to work and come home and lead a life like he never thought he might be able to, in a way that he didn't really realize was possible for him. So it's not a cure-all. I mean, some people continue to have OCD, and it's really a very, very early trial, but I think that you'll see more research in the space trying to help people with OCD. And this goes back to this question about, like, what are psychedelics for? They're really like a cure in search of an indication, and it's a joke because we don't know what psychedelics are best for. They seem to be potentially efficacious for a lot of DSM, I'm using air quotes, diagnoses. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so exciting to be a part of this kind of work.
Yeah. You mentioned the window of neuroplasticity. How do you know this window is related to MDMA and psilocybin? That's the question, if I understand that correctly.
Yeah. So this is, I kind of like to joke about this. So we give people psychedelics and then like they get better and we don't really know why. And there's a huge debate, a series of controversies, and I give a talk on the major controversies in the field as to what are the mechanisms of change or the mediators of change. And some people say it's the mystical experience, and some say it's the DMN shuts down, and some people say that it's an anti-inflammatory effect that has like positive benefit. But one of the leading arguments, and we see this, and I think the jury's still out because it's really hard to study this, is that psychedelics are new learning agents, that they open up a critical learning window through BDNF in the brain, which promotes neuroplasticity, specifically synaptogenesis, and which is new synaptic connections in the brain. And we know that neurons that fire together, wire together. And so there's this idea after psychedelics, and this is potentially true for classical psychedelics like psilocybin and also for ketamine and potentially others, that that when you take a psychedelic, it might be helpful to think that you're opening up a critical learning window, and it's an opportunity in the hours and days immediately following the psychedelic experience to unlearn behaviors you don't want to do anymore, and learn new things, to set new habits into play in your life, to get out of the dried mud of the old wheel well and like pick up the cart and move into a different path altogether. This is a little controversial because the evidence for it is sometimes overblown. Like we don't have like excellent evidence for it. It's really hard to measure before and after just how many synapses are grown or firing or changing, because we don't want to have to. We just can't measure that as well currently in pre and post measures as we might like. But it's a really motivating theory of change that psychedelics, unlike with SSRIs, where it's like there's this sort of debunked serotonin hypothesis that we don't have enough of the good chemicals in our brain. This idea that psychedelics are plastogens, psychoplastogens, that they help us adapt and learn, could be really true. It seems like there's some interesting preliminary evidence for it. The question of how much and how helpful and what's the best way to support that is something that we're trying to think about and embark, for example, with the K domain of keeping momentum, like, and in these critical conversations around integration and how do you integrate, and do you go into your psychedelic session with a plan, or do you come up with a plan afterward? And what we see time and time again is the people who not only get better but stay better are the ones who adopt practices that daily or ongoing practices that help solidify gains for them, so that they don't just revert back to their old ways if they're not in accord with what they wanted, where their long-term goals are.
Yeah, people talk about the rubber band stretching, but then coming back to its original shape. Yeah. I'm aware that we're coming up against the end of our time here, and I want to respect your time, but I can't let you get away without ending with one of our traditional ending questions, which is much less grandiose than our opening sequence of the clock, which is, you've been at this for a while now. Coming up on 20 years, and we have many people in our organization who are just hearing about this now, or they're early in their careers and they want to, I'm sure you get emails like this too. I want to be a psychedelic therapist. How do I become a psychedelic nurse? What advice would you have for your younger self, or somebody who's entering this field now, from what you've learned?
What advice would I give myself?
Yeah. What advice would you give yourself?
I would say it's okay to be afraid. Like, do it anyway.
It's okay to be afraid of what people are going to think about you for doing this, or even more broadly.
Even more broadly, potentially. And I mean that. I mean, I think that psychedelics, they're humbling. Taking them is humbling. Working with people is humbling. Trying to figure out a way to get them approved and sanctioned in our clinical practices is very humbling and often scary. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that fear, but to like kind of lean in to it when and how we best can, when we can, in solidarity with each other. And I mean, and part of that is, if it's okay, I'll just make a kind of a shameless plug. But I'm coming out with a book later this year as an editor with Clancy Kavanaugh and Bela Bache called "Queering Psychedelics," and it's in part about this question about like being afraid, and how Queering Psychedelics is about. It's over 40 chapters with scores of authors about the intersection of psychedelic medicine and consciousness with LGBTQIA plus consciousness and history, including the like scary as heck history of conversion therapy, where psychedelics were used to convert gay people to be straight. That was lauded by leaders in the psychedelic community for decades, and also like points to a different, our current practices that are oftentimes homophobic and transphobic, and points towards new ways of working with these medicines. And I hope it's a good resource for gay and straight people alike. So thanks for thinking about it with me, Andrew, and thanks for inviting me on this incredible program. I love what you guys are doing, and it's really great to be an ally. I don't get to be a nurse, but I do get to be friends with some pretty incredible nurses. So it's really nice to be here with you.
Well, I can't think of a better ally than you to have along on this journey, and really appreciate all the work that you've done so far and all the work that you're doing now and will do in the future. You really are a pioneer in this field, and we're lucky to get to spend some time with you this afternoon. So thanks for making the time, and we look forward to doing this again next month. So stay tuned to your email, and we'll let you know who we'll have on next. So thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Angela. Thanks for having me here. Bye-bye.
All right. Good night, everyone.